Welcome back. Today, we're jumping right into a brand new explainer, and we're taking a really cool cinematic micro to macro journey through the complex web of life. We're going to look at the literal architecture of nature, how life organizes itself from the absolute smallest individual all the way up to the entire planet. Let's get into it. Okay, so let's set the stage by looking at the word ecology itself. It actually comes from the Greek root oikos, which means home, and logos, meaning study. So when you think about it, we are quite literally studying the house rules of nature's home. It's the science of how living organisms relate to each other and to the very environment they live in. Now, what's really wild is that this home of ours, it is never paused. It's completely not static. Instead, it's this constantly shifting balance, a continuous flux of living biotic factors and non-living abiotic forces just constantly changing around every single organism. So, let's start scaling up the neighborhood. Section 1. From individuals to communities. But before we zoom out too far, we've got to understand the baseline. Every individual organism has a niche. And a niche isn't just an address. It's not just where an animal lives. It is a functional job within the household. It encompasses every biological, physical, and chemical factor a species needs to survive, stay healthy, and reproduce. So yeah, a niche is highly unique to every single species. All right, here is our first big zoom out. Step 1, we start with an individual, right? Just an organism acting independently. But then, step 2, that individual joins a population, a group of the exact same species living in a defined area. And finally, step 3, individuals almost never occur by themselves in a vacuum. To survive, populations of different species interact in all sorts of ways to form a fully fledged community. If we look a bit closer at that middle step, the population, it's basically just a simple mathematical tug of war. What makes a population grow? Births and immigration, new arrivals coming in. And what makes it shrink? Well, deaths and emigration, departures. It's a constant balancing act dictated by the limiting abiotic and biotic factors around them. Now, when these populations merge into step 3, communities, they organize based on size and independence. Over on the left, we've got major communities. These are massive, well-organized, and practically independent, driven almost entirely by the sun's energy from the outside. Think of a giant tropical evergreen forest. Then on the right, we have minor communities. These are dependent secondary societies that rely entirely on their bigger neighbors for energy and nutrients. To put that into perspective, the scale here is just extreme. A major community is that sprawling forest, right? But a minor community, that can be as tiny and dependent as a mat of lichen thriving literally on top of a cow dung pad. It just perfectly illustrates how incredibly layered and diverse nature's household really is. Moving on to section 2, the ecosystem engine, where living and non-living interact. So an ecosystem is essentially where the biological community officially shakes hands with the physical environment. This is the structural and functional unit where living beings and physical spaces interact and continuously swap materials. An ecosystem can be as small as a single tree or as massive as a whole forest. It is the true engine of the biosphere. And this engine runs on 2 parallel tracks. We've got abiotic components, the inorganic, non-living parts of the world. And we have biotic components, the living organisms like plants, animals, and microbes. Both of these are absolutely crucial to make the whole thing work. Let's break down the abiotic side first. These factors are basically the non-negotiable house rules. We're talking energy from the sun, rainfall, temperature, the atmosphere, the substratum like soil or land, and all those basic materials. They literally determine where and how well an organism can exist. Even though they all interact, just one limiting factor here, like a sudden drop in temperature or a severe lack of rainfall, can entirely dictate where a species can survive. Then, on the living, biotic side, we split the residents up by how they actually get their food. First up are primary producers, or autotrophs. These are self-nourishing green plants and certain bacteria that essentially cook their own food using the sun. On the flip side, we have consumers, or heterotrophs. These guys cannot make their own food, meaning they absolutely must consume others, whether that's plants, animals, or both, just to stay alive. What's super fascinating to me is that when an ecosystem is running smoothly, it has this amazing capacity for self-regulation. It naturally regulates its own species structure and functional processes to maintain a stable state of equilibrium. In ecology, we call this incredible balanced state homeostasis. But that begs the question, What happens when one perfectly stable ecosystem suddenly crashes into another? That brings us to Section 3, Life at the Edges, where ecosystems collide. This collision creates something called an ecotone. An ecotone is basically the junction or the zone of tension between two or more diverse ecosystems. A really great example is a mangrove forest, which sits right smack at the collision point between a terrestrial ecosystem and a marine ecosystem. Another one would be a riverbank, sitting right there between the water and the land. Because an ecotone bridges two completely distinct worlds, it has some wild traits. First, it has intermediate conditions. You'll see a progressive shift in species, one community fading out while the other fades in. But, and this is cool, a well-developed ecotone also hosts completely unique organisms that you simply won't find in either of the adjacent communities. Plus, it triggers a fascinating ecological phenomenon known as the edge effect. So what is the edge effect? It basically means the sheer density of life in this transitional zone is often drastically higher than in either of the neighboring communities. Take the mix of habitat where a forest meets a desert, for example. The density of bird populations in that specific edge zone is often way greater than in the deep forest or the open desert alone. The edge is literally bursting with life. Which brings us to Section 4, the biosphere skin, the final zoom out. Before we look at the whole globe, we need to talk about biomes. These are the massive, enormous terrestrial regions defined by their sweeping, specific climates, vegetation types, animal life, and soil types. Think of biomes as the major structural wings of nature's house. Okay, now zooming out completely, we hit the biosphere. This is the ultimate, highly integrated zone comprising the atmosphere for air, the hydrosphere for water, and the lithosphere for land. It is the definitive part of the Earth where absolutely all life exists and interacts. Just think about the sheer scale of that for a second. There's a brilliant quote that illustrates this. If we visualize the Earth to be the size of an apple, the biosphere would be as thick as its skin. Every single individual, population, community, and ecosystem we've just talked about, they all exist only on a fragile, narrow layer as thin as an apple's skin wrapping around our planet. And within this incredibly narrow, fragile skin, life follows two fundamental rules to keep going. First, the energy required for life comes from the sun and flows right through the system. Second, the exact same chemical nutrients from the air, water, and soil are recycled endlessly, just over and over again, to keep the whole engine running. Which really leaves us with this final thought. Knowing that our beautifully complex oikos, our natural home, is so remarkably delicate that it's just the skin of an apple floating in the vastness of space, what functional niche will you fill to maintain its balance? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.